How do you tell from science? We'll look at nerves and the nervous system. Thanks to Sam Moyle for producing this PowerPoint. So science understands what to look at. The nervous system is composed of the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. Compare the structure and function of sensory neurons, interneurons, and motor neurons. Describe the structure of the nerve pathway from receptor to effector. Describe the role of synapses and neurotransmitters, and describe the role and pathway of reflex responses. So, nerves are important. Electrochemical signals travel in pulses along nerve cells from one part of the body to another, from one nerve cell to the next nerve cell, and so on, until the message reaches its effector. The electrochemical signals are called nerve impulses, but more correctly they're action potentials. There's a change in polarity of charge along the cell. Nerves are very selective about the target tissue or cells that they innervate. So innervate is cells that they turn on, basically. Hormones will act on any cells that have the receptor for them, whereas nerves will target a specific tissue or cells. Nerve impulses are very short-lived. They last a fraction of a second, and therefore if you want to have a prolonged response, you need to have multiple impulses occurring frequently. So this is the action potential we're talking about. So this is the basic structure of a neuron, a nerve cell. We've got dendrites, which receive the pulse from a previous neuron. We have an axon, which transmits that signal, and this can be quite long. And then we have synaptic terminals at the end, which pass on the impulse to the next neuron. We can see the depolarization here. So the membrane starts slightly negative, it then depolarizes and turns slightly positive, and then it repolarizes back to being negative, and then it hangs around about that level. So that's what happens in an action potential as the nerve impulse passes along the neuron. We need to go into the roles of synapses and neurotransmitters. What happens at the end of a neuron? We have the synaptic cleft. So we have the presynaptic cell and the postsynaptic cell. This is the synaptic terminal of one cell, and this is the dendrite of another cell. The impulse passes along the neuron, along the axon, and it gets to the synaptic terminal. And we see with this change in action potential as it's passing along. So starting negative, we get slightly positive, and then we go back to being negative. At the synaptic terminal, we get neurotransmitters being passed from one cell to another. It starts off with this change in charge, causing the impulse to pass from one end of the nerve cell to the other. It ends up with an exchange of neurotransmitters from one cell to the next. So this is what the neurotransmitters do. So we have the synaptic vesicles, which are carrying the neurotransmitter. They move to the end of the synaptic terminal, and the neurotransmitter is released. The neurotransmitter passes across the synaptic cleft, which is the gap between one nerve cell and the next nerve cell. Neurotransmitter gets bound to a receptor, and that sets off the ion exchange, which leads to that depolarization of the membrane. And then the nerve impulse passes along this cell. We can see the action of several things here. We've got some ions, so calcium ions, for example. So here's our action potential passing along. We get our calcium ion passing a signal onto the vesicles that causes the vesicles to move to the membrane and release the neurotransmitter through exocytosis. The neurotransmitter is bound to a receptor, and that kicks off the next action potential in the next cell. The neurotransmitters are important. We'll talk about them shortly. So let's talk about an example neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. So acetylcholine is made from acetyl-CoA, which we saw as part of respiration. It's part of glycolysis in the citric acid cycle. We get acetyl coenzyme A being produced. That's acetyl-CoA. It combines with choline, so an enzyme does this to produce acetylcholine, and this is one of our neurotransmitters. So it's enclosed by that vesicle, synaptic vesicle. When the appropriate signal is given by those calcium ions, it moves to the synaptic cleft. We get exocytosis. The acetylcholine gets released. The acetylcholine is picked up by the postsynaptic cell, and then it gets broken down. Then an enzyme breaks down the acetylcholine, returns the choline back to the previous cell, and it can be used again. So there's two types of neurotransmitter. There's excitatory and inhibitory. So excitatory neurotransmitters stimulate the next neuron on the pathway, and inhibitory neurotransmitters block the nerve impulse from continuing. And you might know some of these names of neurotransmitters: dopamine, serotonin, glutamate, and acetylcholine. We talked about GABA, glycine, and dopamine. Maybe not so much. You might have heard of dopamine more than you might have heard of, glutamate. So dopamine is both excitatory and inhibitory, which is kind of interesting. So now we have a bit of an idea about how a nerve works. Let's talk about the nervous system. So the nervous system is composed of the central nervous system, often referred to as the CNS, and the peripheral nervous system, the PNS. So the CNS, central nervous system, is the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is everything outside of that. Inside the peripheral nervous system, we have the somatic nervous system, and this is voluntary. This is where you get to make choices about things like moving your arm and waving. There's also the autonomic nervous system as part of the peripheral nervous system, and that contains involuntary nerves, which regulate things that we don't necessarily think about. We don't think of our breathing rate or our heart rate, for example. We don't control those through conscious thought. The autonomic nervous system is also further broken down into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. So sympathetic, flight, homeostasis, and parasympathetic, rest and digest. So they're kind of antagonistic. They're opposed to each other. Here's a diagram showing that. So we have our central nervous system and we have our peripheral nervous system. In the peripheral nervous system, we have the autonomic and the somatic. So the somatic is the ones that you control over. There's also sense organs as well too. Autonomic, internal organs and glands, things that you don't have control over based on choices that you make. And the autonomic is broken into the sympathetic and parasympathetic. So arousing and calming. In the somatic nervous system, we can also break it up into the sensory and the motor nervous systems. So the sensory nervous system picks up sensory inputs, and the motor nervous system causes outputs, motor outputs, changing the movements of muscles, for example. So now we need to go through the three main types of neurons. So the sensory neurons, they carry information towards the central nervous system. So these are afferent. Afferent arrive, that's how you remember which way they're going. So signals stimulate receptors, and we've talked about some of those receptors previously. So we have mechanoreceptors, chemoreceptors, thermoreceptors, and that triggers action potentials towards the central nervous system. So sensory neurons are referred to as unipolar cells, and then we have interneurons, which are located in the central nervous system, and their job is to receive signals from sensory neurons and then convey those signals onto motor neurons, and these are multipolar cells. And then we have our motor neurons, which carry signals from the central nervous system to the effectors, and these are multipolar cells as well. So they look structurally different. So sensory neuron has a receptor cell attached at one end often, so this is picking up information like things like a temperature change, or light has hit it, or a loud sound has caused the cell to change shape. The cell body is located partway along the cell, so the cell body contains the nucleus and cytoplasm and the bits that keep the cell functioning. And then we have our synaptic terminals at the end. Now here it's called relay neurons instead of interneurons, but they're the same thing. So an interneuron takes in information from the sensory neurons, and then that sends that off to motor neurons. So the cell body is located at the end with the dendrites. Then we have an axon fiber. Now these cells are pretty small compared to sensory neurons or motor neurons, and that's why they don't have a myelin sheath around them. Myelin sheath is important for insulating so that information isn't lost as the action potential passes through it. And then we have our motor neurons. So our motor neurons could be connected to interneurons. So we have dendrites here, a fairly large cell body. Then we have our long myelin sheath. And then at the end of the motor neuron, we have our effector. So this could be a muscle, for example. So let's have a look at how these neurons work with each other in a reflex response. So we're going to go through the reflex response in a bit of detail shortly, but we've already talked about this a little bit. You put your finger over a hot object, you don't have to think about, oh, that is burning, I need to pull my arm away. You'll automatically just pull your finger away from something hot. And that's a reflex, and we're going to go through those again shortly. We can see our sensory neurons, our interneurons, and our motor neurons in this diagram. So we have our receptor in our finger here, so it could be a pain receptor, it could be a thermoreceptor. Then we have our motor neuron, which is taking the impulse to the central nervous system. So this is a part of the spine in here. In the spinal column, we have all this grey matter in here. So these are our nerve cells in the central nervous system. So we have our interneuron here. So this is the one that they called the relay neuron in the picture before. So here's our interneuron. And then the impulse passes to a motor neuron, and the motor neuron in this case is our bicep. So that bicep is going to contract, and that pulls your finger away from the hot flame. So this is the effector. So this is the part of the body that is doing the job based on receiving that signal. So we've seen this in terms of the stimulus response model. So stimulus is detected by a receptor. In this case, it's the burn on the fingertips. So we have pain receptors and thermoreceptors in the fingertip picking up the stimulus of a large increase in temperature at the end of your finger. An impulse is then sent along a sensory neuron to the central nervous system, which is going to be our control center for this in this stimulus response cycle. So in this case, it's in the spinal cord. Interneurons in the control center then trigger a response by activating an effector by sending an impulse along a motor neuron to an effector. And in this case, the effector, if we're looking at our finger, moving our finger, it's going to be the muscles in the arm that will pull your finger away from the flame. So the effector removes the stimulus or initiates an action that negates the stimulus. So we're reducing the impact of the stimulus by pulling our finger away from the flame. So then we get back to the status quo that we had before we dipped our finger into the flame. And in our nervous system, we're looking at this as just removing your hand from the flame. Remember, the stimulus response model works for hormones too. So this is the image that we had before looking at the stimulus response model. So stimulus, we get a change. We have a receptor detecting that change. That passes the information, in this case in the nervous system, along a sensory neuron to the control center. This is where we'd have our interneurons. The control center sends the signal to an effector along motor neurons, and then the effector leads to a change that reduces the stimulus and gets back to balance. The last thing we need to talk about is the reflex response. So one of the simplest behaviors is the reflex response because it's automatic and you don't have to think about it. So the brain isn't directly involved in the loop, just the central nervous system and not necessarily higher thought processes. So parts of the brain might be involved, but very simple parts of the brain are involved. So we get a rapid response to a stimulus that doesn't require conscious thought for that response to occur. You can use consciousness to override some reflexes. You could decide to place your finger in a flame. I probably wouldn't because it would hurt. That oftentimes you won't even notice when you are doing things that are reflex actions. If you're falling, you put your hands out in front of you to try and reduce the fall. That's a reflex. If a loud sound goes off, you might duck and cover your ears. That's a reflex. If a ball's coming towards you, you'll put your hands up towards your eyes to stop the ball from hitting you in the face. That's a reflex. And that's why we used our flame example here, because this is all about reflexes and it doesn't involve higher thought. So we have our stimulus and we want to have the fastest response possible so that we don't burn our finger. So the sensory neuron takes the impulse from the receptor to an interneuron in the central nervous system, which then relays the signal to a motor neuron, which leads to an effector changing what it's doing to lead to an effect which reduces the stimulus. So let's do our check. So the nervous system is composed of the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. Compare the structure and function of sensory neurons, interneurons, and motor neurons. Describe the structure of a nerve pathway from a receptor to effector. Describe the role of synapses and neurotransmitters, and describe the role and pathway of reflex responses. So today on Flippin Science, we looked at neurons in the nervous system. That's it for Flippin Science today. See ya!